Welcome back to Chain Reaction, the Foreign Policy Research Institute's flagship network of podcast series examining the political, security, economic, and social trends shaping our world. Throughout the year, we'll be talking with experts about developments in Russia's war in Ukraine, the new European security order, defense and geopolitical issues in the Baltic states, as well as current and future national security challenges and opportunities in the technology and space sectors. Join us each month for
Bear Market Brief,
Behind the Front,
Baltic Ways,
Report in Short,
The Ties That Bind, NATO Allies in Action. New episodes are available each week on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and most streaming services. To be the first to know about new releases, you can subscribe to FPRI's Insights newsletter. That's fprinsights.substack.com, or follow the link available in the description of this episode. Thanks for joining us. This week on Behind the Front.
What is the future of American-made collaborative combat aircraft, and how has the technology evolved? In this latest podcast, I sat down to continue our series on this technology, the aircraft themselves, and what they may mean for conflict in Europe and Asia. Enjoy! Hello and welcome. My name is Aaron Stein, President of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and today I'm joined by Scott Gilloon, who currently serves as the Sector Vice President of Air Force Strategic Development and Capability Assessments at General Atomics. Prior to joining General Atomics, Scott served in the U.S. Air Force, where he was an accomplished standardization and evaluation flight examiner, instructor pilot, and commander with more than 3,000 hours in Air Force aircraft, such as the F-15C and F-16. Scott, it's great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Aaron. It's really a pleasure to be here.
So we're actually not going to be talking about a human in the cockpit aircraft today. We did talk to your competitor at Anduril a couple of months ago about combat collaborative aircraft. And I thought, it would be great to have on both competitors, or I think you're frenemies, in this competition. And luckily, you guys were nice enough to say yes. So I appreciate it.
Not a problem. It's funny. I was just with Scar the other day, yesterday. We see each other all the time, talk plenty. So as always, these communities are small, right? Fighter pilot community is pretty small. We generally say 1 degree of separation. So we still see each other and chatter, fairly often enough.
Well, that's great. Well, Scar was obviously the guest, so listeners can listen to both. But let's jump into the first question here. Our audience should be familiar with what CCAs are supposed to do and what they are. And I should say that when we drop into acronym CCAs, Combat Collaborative Aircraft, perhaps you could tell us the origin story of General Atomics CCA, the YFQ-42.
Most people, I think, from the general public side, probably know General Atomics best for the MQ-9, MQ-1, MQ-9 family of aircraft. What they probably don't realize is back in kind of the late 2000s, we began developing a jet-powered UAS at that time. That is our aircraft, the MQ-20. So if you type in Avenger or MQ-20 into your browser, you'll find plenty of pictures of that, or we can send some to you, I guess, if somebody wants. But that platform really paved the way for us, and from an industry perspective, there's always lots of talk about open systems, open platforms, open mission systems. For us, the reason we put started with open systems on that platform in particular is just because it's faster and easier and works out better for industry, right? So we started there. Over time, that platform proved a wonderfully valuable test asset as well as an asset for particular customers. But it led into, for us, a sort of rethinking about jet-powered UAS and what we could potentially do with them. In parallel, we had kind of a couple other pieces to this. We had an extremely talented and gifted set of aeronautical design folks, and led by Dr. Robert Love. And he had this idea. He said, "Hey, what if we could build an aircraft around a common core? Like, what would that really look like?" And so he floated this to AFRL. This is probably circa 2014. And said, "Hey, we could take a common core and we could build different variants. So we don't have to just stay with one particular variant of aircraft, right? We could have, multiple different variants. So one that's maybe air to air, one that's air to ground, because each of them you're going to have trades, but you kind of want some sort of core so that you're not having to retool a line, retool manufacturing, but also so that you can move faster." And so we had this idea. So this is, just over a decade ago. Well, fast forward through the process. In the interim, we have I'll call it the larger share of autonomy work picking up. And that was with a couple different offices. The Air Force stood up their Skyborg program, and we ended up using the MQ-20 for that. Why that's important? There was another program under the Chief Digital AI Office at the time called the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. Well, they were starting one called Smart Sensor. All these programs were coalescing around a software stack that would allow us to host in an open framework the autonomy for these platforms. So you got the platform developing, right? And then you got the software developing. So you have both of them beginning to move very, very much, I'll call it in parallel. But in test, we're working with the Air Force now, putting them into a platform. That was our MQ-20. So keeping that moving as we kind of proceed through. So now we're in like the late 20 teens, right around going into 2020. And so now we're flying the autonomy stack. We're evaluating it. We're testing different behaviors and really doing this. I mean, right now, at present, weekly. Before this, it depended, sometimes several times a week. And then, you take a break to evaluate, retrain the behaviors, and then deploy them again. So, all through this, we've got this test and evaluation piece going on. Well, somewhere in there, so a couple years ago, the Air Force decided, you know what, we've proven this technology is sufficiently ready. And I think from a General Atomics perspective, we were felt extremely proud to just be a part of that. Right. So to have some role in not necessarily even shaping, but being a partner in the technology development. So they decided to kick off the CCA program. Well, right right behind or right just prior to that, you had what we called the offboard sensing station. That was the AFRL program, or you can look this one, the XQ-67A was the designation. Right. So that's the first platform that took that core, that common core. What you'll see is the Gambit Common Core, and produced an aircraft. That one is for sensing. So think of it as an aircraft that's designed or optimized to sense in the battle space and help provide the battle space awareness. So like that piece, well, we took that core, it's the same core now, and moved into the CCA program. What that allowed us to do is move very, very quickly, right? Control costs, which is always a driver, right? So you want to move fast, but there's always these trades. You only have these buckets, and you can take from one, but you kind of can't, just create something out of thin air. And so there's always a trade. But it allowed us to move very quickly, control costs, because we knew what things would cost. And so we were able to walk into the government and say, hey, here's what the price is, because this is what we're currently paying right now. So we have very high accuracy. So it allowed us to keep the program on schedule at cost. And where we are today, we're not only flying the XQ-67, we're flying now the YFQ-42. We're in test. We've got another aircraft that I think you'll see fly very soon. So I think it's given us this ability as a nation, to find a way to move very quickly. And think about this: just in a couple years, we've been able to do this, right? So we went from program initiation to first flight in less than 2 years. I think that to me is pretty exciting, because it shows just how quickly not only industry, but the nation can move when we have urgent priorities.
So, you threw out a lot there, and I have a lot of follow-up questions. These things, so combat collaborative aircraft, like in theory, right? And that's something I want to come back to, is that I think we're still working on exactly how we are thinking about, we being, I guess, industry, think tanks, and I would even say the Air Force, are thinking about what exactly they're supposed to do. But I think we all agree that they're designed to be part of a family of systems melded together with current stuff we have. So current fighters, current aircraft, current everything that we have. So I realize there are things that you can't talk about, but perhaps you could tell us how you all are thinking about how these things can and should be used in combat.
Sure. Well, the first, I think, with the XQ-67, you see kind of one version, right? Which is, hey, what would something look like if we were going to optimize a sensor to fly in formation to work with various aircraft? What would that look like, right? And how could we use that core to then build something that's air to air? And so you can see in our variants, at least the first two that are out there, we've got one that's designed for air to air. We've got one that's designed for sensing, right? So you can do many other missions with this. Air to ground certainly is no different. You just kind of keep picking these, and you can optimize what we'll call the chassis. So you've got your common core and your chassis, right? And so we've got we've got kind of this way of building things that's modular, that allows people to experiment and with the different missions. Well, that's no different really with the payloads. And why the payloads are important, because it gets to your question about kind of the interoperability. And so what comes up many times is people ask, well, if it's optimized for the Pacific, well, what does that mean when we move that over to Europe, right? Or we look at some other place in the world. And so the way we approach this, is what I'll say is, in general, let's just break it down into kind of the hardware, the software, and then the tactics, right? So they'll kind of lead into each other. And so from a software perspective, think about it. The way that this aircraft is sort of optimized to not only move quickly, but to control costs is think of it more in terms of software-defined apertures, software-defined everything. And so if somebody says, hey, well, we want to talk on this particular frequency or this method of communication, we want to use this aperture, it's not a problem. It's meant to be modular so that you can optimize it. So if somebody says, hey, we're going to use a Link 16 to communicate, or we're going to use some other waveform, that's okay. The NATO standard is Link 16, so we'll just kind of settle on that for a minute. When you start to bring all of these pieces together, I'll focus on Europe because it's it's got its own unique advantages. In Europe, I have a large terrestrial communications network, right? I've got overhead assets, I've got towers, you've got so much infrastructure. What that really affords you is the ability to say, hey, I don't have to necessarily modify the aircraft I have. Sure, I have to do some software work. It's kind of like anything, right? And if I want to talk to or communicate with something, I got to kind of figure out a way. But that's at a level that's manageable. Link 16, for example, you don't need to change Link 16. What we can do is if you said, hey, I want to communicate with a CCA on some other radio, okay, we'd use things like crossbanding, right? So you take it and you pick the radio you want. We do this with first responders all the time. Say, hey, well, those guys are on VHF and those other guys are on UHF. How do we manage this? And all we do is we use software to bridge them. And that's what I'm talking about is doing things maybe a little bit smarter, picking up some advantages we learned in the commercial spaces and other things that we've done, even domestically, but allowing people the flexibility to optimize kind of how they choose to employ the aircraft. So that kind of gets to the tactics. More about that in a second. But here we've got the software that allows you to I don't want to say plug and play because that's maybe a poor analogy because there's always a little work, but it is an entirely open platform in the sense that we're using the Air Force or the U.S. government's government reference architecture for all the mission systems, right? So that is complete through the aircraft. So we have that ability to add things as long as they conform to that architecture, or most people know open mission standards, right? Open mission systems, OMS standards. And so you've got that. So that's kind of your systems. It allows us to pick the pieces and parts that you can optimize with the aircraft you fly, right? So if you're, let's say, fighter aircraft, if your fighters have this sensor suite, then you can optimize the sensor suite on a CCA to complement that, right? So that you get a more robust battle space picture. Higher situational awareness makes everybody generally better. And when we get to the autonomy, it's very, very similar. It's designed to have an open framework. And so the questions that come up a lot are, well, who writes the autonomy and how do we do that? The beauty of autonomy is it's tailorable. If you have a particular set of tactics or a particular way of method of employment, the autonomy, the wonderful thing about it is it allows you to optimize the platform, the CCA, for how you employ or to explore new tactics, new ways of doing things, right? So it gives you that flexibility. Also has a government reference architecture and allows us to employ it in an open way. So if you've got a particular behavior, or we call it a skill, that comes from some smaller business or some other company, you can bring that in and integrate it very quickly. Normally, we can do that. For us, I'll just say, we do that, generally speaking, in a few days to a week. It's kind of our ability to bring in and incorporate different behaviors. So fairly rapid. And that's just in terms of, that's not pushing the envelope on how fast we can go. That's just a normal timeline for what we do every day. But I will highlight, though, that one of the important things that often does also come up when we talk autonomy is people say, well, well, I can use a simulator, right? We can do this. We can simulate. We can use physics-based models, and we can just simulate everything. We can train our autonomy, and we don't really need to fly these CCA. We kind of, we'll hold them in a container, the break glass in time of emergency, right? That type of mentality. And so when we look at it, I would take a slightly different view from that and say that you actually do need to fly the autonomy. And maybe it's not a perfect analogy, but I look at it very similar to why we fly airplanes or combat aircraft to begin with, right? The simulator is very valuable for repetition. Repetition helps me build the right habit patterns, but I still need to go out and experience an operational environment where things aren't perfect. Because when things aren't perfect, sometimes if we don't have the right training or we don't have the right habits, our game plan begins to break down. And so that's what we're talking about here, and what we see and why we fly so much from General Atomics perspective in our test aircraft. Is to evaluate the autonomy, to see, hey, was it when we take out an aircraft, the same way we would do it in the fighter business? Was it a valid game plan or an invalid assumption, or vice versa? And so you can't, it's almost impossible to test those fully without going into the real world and just, flying an aircraft. So to kind of bring it back around, how are they going to work together, and how does this all come together eventually for missions? At the end of the day, I firmly believe in open mission systems. That's the best thing that anyone can do when they come at this problem, is to ensure as an open environment as possible for adding hardware, software, and then autonomy on top of that.
Hey everybody, I just wanted to take a minute to tell you all about a publication we launched at FPRI called Behind the Front. Behind the Front is where we at FPRI will analyze current and future national security challenges to the United States with a specific focus on the defense industrial base, fixing our broken military procurement system, and the challenges and opportunities in technology and from the emerging space sector. Check it out at behindthefront.substack.com. And now back to our conversation. So you can't see my piece of paper, nor can the listeners, but I'm holding it up. And literally what I have written down here was autonomy towards sim towards repetition. So so the question I was thinking about is, so when you're thinking about how you're training the autonomy aspect of your underlying software, right? A lot of it is going to be, let's say, threat-based, is my guess. Is so I'm not trying to get you to reveal anything, classified here, but one can infer that you will look at potential adversaries that you would be thinking about, have access to the super secret stuff, and then use the super secret stuff to help inform your models for how you would expect the CCA to operate. And so the question I had is, isn't there an inherent, advantage if you're so software dependent that you can test it over and over again in the sim before you take it out into the real world environment to either drive down cost before you actually field it and ultimately test it? Because, you're always sort of making some assumptions about how your adversary will react, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, you're right. We always, will evaluate particular behaviors or in the simulation environment before taking them out in the real world. And we'll do that really to just, one, assess performance. Is it performing as we expected, or is it doing something wild and different? So we'll do it to evaluate the performance, and then evaluate overall. Are we, is it achieving the objective? Is it meeting the intent, right? So you can do some pretty high level, pretty quick analysis to see whether or not it's going to hold in the real world. Certainly, you can use the super secret models and things to train your behavior. But I think in the world we're moving into, we're getting to the point where autonomy doesn't necessarily need the super secret model, right? So now we get into the we move away from the deterministic side, and now we get much more into kind of a reinforcement learning, and then into what I'll call the agentic, or now we start to get into the fancy world of AI, to where it's doing its own thinking and reasoning, right? And so we'll just start with kind of the deterministic, and you say, hey, can we use that in a sim? Can we evaluate it? Yes, it's very consistent. It's important because it can help us build trust, right? And now as I build trust, now I begin to layer in the reinforcement learned behaviors, right? So now I can allow the autonomy a little bit more freedom to not only determine which tactic might be the most effective in a particular scenario, but how to optimize itself with the human and the aircraft next to it, right? And so now, as we start to move in those spaces, there's always this, uncertainty with data. And what we're learning and what we're seeing is, that you can record, server farms full of data, but it may be the wrong data, may not be useful. It may have a lot of the data has a half-life, and it's not all the same half-life. And so it gets pretty complicated on the data science side. And we tend to focus on kind of, hey, I want autonomy to solve all my problems. Well, there's this other side that says, hey, did you collect all the right data so that autonomy could even have a chance of solving those problems? And that's true whether it's synthetic data or whether it's data you've pulled from the real world. And so part of the way that we approach this is we approach it from a blended environment. So we can pull in the real data or real sensor data that we have, and we can feed that directly into our simulation environment to evaluate those skills and behaviors in the simulation environment. And you can do the same. You can take the simulated data and we can push that to the real world in mixed formations. We do that every single time we fly. So it gets to your point of, hey, what do you do? Where's the synthetic? Where's the real world? And we can adjust models, threat models. We can adjust those in real time. And for us, it's about efficiency in training, and so I can do this multiple different times with multiple different behaviors. We've taken an entire autonomy stack. So think of it in terms of like the entire brain, the mission brain, right? We do this all the time. And we just actually did a demonstration for the government to where the aircraft's still flying and we trade out the mission autonomy, the full stack of it. And now, when you think about it in terms of like, it's like kind of like being in a math class and swapping out your brain in a test and then going straight and continuing on with the problems. But that's the beauty of the software and the flexibility, especially when you approach it with an open compute system like that, or an open core, autonomy core in this case. So it's that way that I think that, we learn and what we see, and now we can apply that very quickly. We can take some of the high order lessons out of the synthetic data or the synthetic environment and evaluate which ones hold in the real world and which ones don't, which ones start to fall apart. And that way we get a better understanding of kind of where those bounds are, like how useful is a particular batch of synthetic data versus the real world. Because there are trades. But that's the piece that I think that experience gets you in flying, right? And so back to that question of, do we fly all the time? Do we not? What does repetition look like when we start talking about autonomous systems or autonomous collaborative platforms? All of those questions, that's the really exciting part about where we are right now, is that we're just cracking this open and really getting to define some of these problems, but also to get to the initial portions, at least to some of those answers.
And coming from a company perspective, the MQ-1 is actually a really good story of rapid iterative design. If you go back to the history of 2000, 2001, or I guess even 98 to 2001, different podcast. But MQ-1s to MQ-9s have been in heavy use all over the world, basically for a lot of our listeners, probably entire adult lives, right? What lessons were you able to take out of that? Thinking about communication architecture, stuff like that, if any, applied to this. I do realize they're entirely different systems, but when you were talking about how to use software to move between different communication networks, basically plugging things in so one part of the team can talk to another part of the team, seems simple, but not always entirely thought through when systems are designed. And so you're having to come up with workarounds like in real time. And so you're trying to anticipate those workarounds this time around. So how did sort of the lessons of the company, if sort of inform some of these things for the CCA?
Sure. So I got to see a lot of that. It's fun. When I was flying on active duty, and we had, I can remember the first times when I was a young lieutenant, we had an unmanned system in the airspace, right? And they set a bubble around it, and all anybody wanted to do was go take a look because they were so new and different at that time. And then over the successive years, we figured out how to make those part of the team, a team, whether that was close air support or whether it was some sort of other mission where we were attempting to locate, find, fix, track, targets, those sorts of things. That's still collaboration, and it is just immensely valuable. There's a tremendous amount of value in just having gone through that exercise, right? Because we know, hey, these are the networks. This was the limitation. Here were the pros and cons of different data networks and things. By just simply collaborating with humans, we've been figuring this out for decades. And I don't think a lot, it's tough sometimes because people say, well, what's the transferability between somebody who's on the ground on an ATAC tablet, an ATAC software enabled tablet doing close air support versus somebody who's in an aircraft, trying to do an air-to-air mission. Well, guess what? Right now, they probably both use tablets.
Right.
So point number one, right? Number two, they both use open software that they're using to communicate with an uncrewed system. Starting to look pretty similar, right? So like all of these things, we've come from a spot where we've been able to leverage, this journey over decades. And so when we get to, the MQ-1, the MQ-9, there are other pieces that we pull from that. I love the story with the Army. So the Army, they've never had humans landing their aircraft, right? The Gray Eagle, right? The humans don't do it. And so early on, it's fun to get to talk to some of the old hats in the software side, because they're like, yeah, early on, the thing kept landing in the same spot. And why that's bad on a runway, anybody who flies knows you don't want to land in the same spot. Rubber deposits and everything, you don't want to do that. So then they had to figure out how to actually inject air in the system so that it wouldn't land in the exact same spot every time. And to me, it's sort of informative about how autonomous, or in this case, an automated system looks at a problem. It sees the same problem. It's going to apply, that solution. Well, now we get to the point where we bring in autonomy, right? So it's not just automated, it's autonomy. So now it's using a little bit more logic and stepping through that challenge. So building its own pattern to come in and land. That's where we are with, let's just say like an MQ-9. And so now it can come in and it can build its own pattern and come in and safely execute a landing, or if necessary, go around. So when you look at that and now you apply that, you take that bundle of software, it is absolutely valuable than when you apply that to a CCA. And so because it allows us to go so much faster, right? We can say, yeah, here are some lessons. There's some very valuable pieces that we can pull from them, take those pieces and build from there. So we kind of have I'll call it a further, a departure point that's maybe further down the road than if we were just starting out, and incorporating uncrewed systems.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard the Navy's dealing with this with Magic Carpet on the carrier deck. But we were coming sort of to the end here, but I have sort of two linking questions. Is everybody always talks about the size of the problem in the Indo-Pacific. The Pacific is just massive, right? And so you're dealing with the ultimate trade-off here between size, range, and cost of a potential CCA. And so my brain always goes to a very good place to actually think about how to test or how to operate these things is actually Europe, right? Because as you were saying earlier, there's a considerable amount of infrastructure already built. And no offense to our European colleagues who are listening to this, it's just not a very large place, right? It is large, but it's ultimately not that large. And then the distances between infrastructure is quite small. So perhaps thinking about sort of the broader challenges that the Indo-Pacific talks about and thinking about the design of a CCA. And two, and I you made me think about this. You flew single seaters, I think, right? F-16 and F-15. And you just talked about how you'll have to incorporate a tablet, right? So you're a single seat guy. Mm-hmm. Now, with the prospect of potential integration of these things with a tablet or something, how does that add to at least how you guys are thinking about pilot fatigue in terms of the ultimate things you all will have to be doing?
Okay, so I'll answer the kind of the tablet piece first, and then I'll jump back to the overall theaters type problem. So on the tablet piece, what I'll say is that's where things like flying in a simulator are just wonderfully valuable, right? Because I can put somebody in a simulator, I can teach them, we can work on habit patterns. Here are the things that you want to be able to do, or here's how you would interact with the CCA with the tablet. So I can train somebody pretty efficiently with that. I can sit right next to them. We can go through this repetition-wise, right? So it doesn't terrify me. Are there better ways to do it? Sure. Put everything, we all love it under the glass, right? There's nobody, who wouldn't want everything under the glass to be able to just touch touch a particular function and go. But what a tablet does is it allows us to also move very, very quickly outside of an aircraft, operational flight program sort of update. So an aircraft software update. You don't have to upgrade the whole aircraft to go. And I think this should appeal, especially it should resonate with folks who realize the timelines we're generally on for this. We're on multiple year in between upgrades for aircraft software. Tablet, not the same way. Go out and load tablet software and go. So I think that part makes it pretty flexible. For the overall trades and kind of when you look at aircraft, I'll say there's never an easy answer, right? Because it's you can optimize for one, and does that optimize for the other theater? So if I optimize for the Pacific, am I cutting out or am I otherwise excluding certain advantages, knowingly or unknowingly, really, of that I can leverage in a European theater? Well, what I'll say, when we looked at the problem, we did actually, I'll call it very carefully, step through this. Taking the core, we started with the core, and as we built out the airframe, we looked at things like the number of runways, the average runway lengths. We looked at and we did a lot of work analyzing how fast does it take to turn the aircraft. People don't think about that when you just build an airplane. People are like, no, you're just putting pieces and parts together. Do the ailerons work? Are the control surfaces sufficient? That type of stuff.
You mean turn it on the ground, right? This is just lands and turns, right? Sorry for people. It's not turning it around. It's landing, refueling, rearming, and going. Go ahead. Yep.
Yeah, refuel, rearm, and go. And that's kind of the important piece we get after from an Air Force perspective. ACE, right? ACE has been something in the European theater. So that's a Cold War, just I'll call it mainstay, right? Where the highway strips and sort of this agile combat employment methodology. We were just talking with some representatives from Sweden the other day because they're probably the best at it. At this overall kind of this agile employment model. And so we absolutely went through and looked at that. And we made sure that our times were at or less than any aircraft that is presently in the fleet. Because you certainly don't want to create a burden, right, when you bring something. So we had to make sure of that. We also had to make sure of things like you don't normally take into consideration ground support equipment. Right? These are the less sexy pieces of aircraft design. But they are so vital because you don't want to design out an advantage of operating from one location or another. And so we had to take in the ground support equipment piece of this. So there are all these other things that come into aircraft design that just normally we don't, they just don't normally pop into view when you're laying out an aircraft. But it was very, very useful and valuable to do that. The other piece of this, and I will say that it's, what CCA kind of give us the opportunity to do is think differently. And so when I look at it, I say, well, what if I had the range to say self-deploy from the United States to Europe, right? Well, that distance, when I go to the Pacific, that distance is probably something like the US to Hawaii. So it gets you moving, at least in the Pacific. The Pacific's pretty big. When I flip that around and I look at it differently, that's like going, from Alaska to Europe over the top of the globe, right? So or from, if I bounce off from Labrador over to Europe, these become very significant enablers because now I'm communicating to the adversary a very, very different picture. I'm here and I can support my allies no matter where I am, right? And so now the adversaries have to account for that. So how you bring that back into aircraft design, well, it was so important to us to be able to provide that type of capability to say, hey, you don't necessarily need to always have the asset right in theater every time. We can mix and match and flow these as you require, right? So it gives you another dimension to combat employment. So when you think ACE and we think agile combat employment, we don't normally think about agile as, hey, I could actually deploy these from the United States or from some other location around the globe. I'm just using the US as an example, but it could certainly apply from flying into Northern Europe, from Southern Europe, right? From somewhere down the other side of the Mediterranean. So it gives you these multiple axes that you can feed a fight that your adversary has to consider. They have to account for that. And so it's those ways of thinking to me that become most important when we look at how do I impose costs? This gets to your deterrence. This gets to all the pieces. And I know you didn't ask about that, but this is probably somewhere where you guys excel. It allows you to have those conversations simply as part of an aircraft conversation, right? So it enables the better part of what I'll call the ability to shape things left of conflict, and then should conflict break out, now it gives you the advantage in conflict or in combat, right? Because now we've already looked at how fast we can turn the aircraft, how quickly we can refuel, rearm, and get back in the air. And so all of those things kind of come to play here when we just when we talk about aircraft design. So incredibly more, I will say, more involved than probably that most folks would think of when you go to an air, when you talk about air vehicle design. But it was certainly the set of characteristics we looked at and we accounted for.
Yeah, it always reminds me that the Earth is round, despite what some people on the internet say. So, I guess final question is that the first flight I have here is on August 27, 2025. If some people are curious to keep following this, what are the next milestones you guys are looking to hit? And then I'll let you get out of here.
All right. Well, you'll see more aircraft for us. So you're going to see the next aircraft flying. I'm not going to say when. That's the purview of the United States Air Force. But what I will say is we're continuing to produce aircraft. And those aircraft, as part of their qualification, are going to begin flying here very shortly. I think the exciting piece for everyone is to know is we are in flight test. Like, flight test has begun. We're very excited when you look at an aircraft and you're like, hey, the first flight of this CCA. But as we were saying before, the XQ-67 really proved that, hey, we can, this aircraft, this air vehicle, with some subtle changes, I'll say, to account for a new mission, it's flying. So it's kind of like, yes, it's the first flight of this design, but the actual family has been flying. We have a lot of time under the family. And so it's I think a really exciting time to be in uncrewed systems. And, when we look at how this is really just kind of I'll call it in the broader sense, even the airplane business, but from my background and kind of the fighter side of it, it's really a fascinating time to see, because we're going to be able to experiment with tactics, with aircraft that we just haven't had the capacity or the ability to do before. Look at risk differently, risk to machine, risk to human, and all of those things now, all of those become tools that we can provide back to the warfighter, back to the commanders, back to the nations to decide how and what they want to use the aircraft, to what extent. So I think it's just some of the exciting stuff that comes out of the first flight and really the beginning of flight test.
Well, Scott, thanks for taking so much time to chat with us this morning. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely, thanks, and I appreciate all the folks who download the podcast to listen in.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Behind the Front, a special series of the Chain Reaction podcast at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. To learn more about this and many other initiatives, please visit us at fpr.org. Until next time.